Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a police standoff a mile underground.
The aim is to force people working in an illegal mine in Stilfontein to return to the surface where they'll be arrested.
In South Africa, authorities had been trying to, quote, smoke them out by cutting off food and supplies, forcing them to the surface. But now, as time ticks by, the standoff is turning into a rescue operation. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Right now, in the town of Stilfontein, about 150 kilometers southwest of Johannesburg, hundreds of men are huddled together thousands of feet below ground. They are called Zama Zamas, illegal miners that eke out a living from the scraps of gold that are still salvageable from abandoned mines, while their syndicate bosses make millions. Joining us now is Kimon de Greef. He's a freelance reporter from South Africa. Kimon, you've been writing about Zama Zamas since long before this current crisis started to play out. Let's just start with some basics. What is a Zama Zama, and what are they doing underground in the first place?
So in South Africa, the term Zama Zama loosely applies to any illegal miner of any description. So that's somebody taking gold or diamonds or chrome. By far the most criminalized of them is South Africa's illicit mining industry for gold. And South Africa, being formerly the world's largest gold producer, has of old gold shafts that are, in many cases, the deepest gold shafts in the world. Many of those mines are closed down. They're no longer deemed profitable by the mining industry. It's extremely expensive to run formal deep-level mines. And so in the past 20 years or so, many of these Zama Zamas, as they're known, which is popularly understood to derive from a Zulu phrase for take a chance. They've taken a chance and gone down into these tunnels and they dig around for gold down there. Generally, most of the illegal miners they catch are from neighboring countries such as Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Mozambique. Notably, these are all countries that once sent huge numbers of laborers to work on the gold mines in the apartheid years of South Africa's gold mining industry. So there's a long legacy of people being brought in as laborers. The reason that they were recruited in the first place was to depress the wages paid to Black workers. And this enabled South Africa's gold mining industry to make huge profits and provide the bulk of the world's gold at extremely low cost, especially given how expensive it is to get down to those depths. So today there's kind of like a shadow of that industry at play where thousands of young men from these neighboring countries end up here in the abandoned mines digging for the residue of that gold.
So we're talking about very poor migrant workers from Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. Just how thin are the margins here? Because I know that they actually have to pay for the privilege to do this incredibly dangerous work.
So firstly, the black market price for gold is lower than, what you would see in the financials at the end of the day. Right now, the Zama Zamas in Stilfontein, where this crisis is unfolding, report earning around about 1,000 Rand per gram. That's less than the total gold price. Also, because these shafts are controlled by incredibly powerful gangs, in most cases, Zama Zamas need to pay to come in and pay to go out. Additionally, once they're down there, they need to survive. Some miners spend weeks underground. Some miners spend years underground. I was speaking to a security expert in a neighboring town to Stilfontein last week, who said that last year in 2023, they apprehended some guys who had been underground since 2015, which I still don't actually believe is possible, but I trust the guy, I trust the source. Still unimaginable. And one of the reasons they stayed on so long is the syndicates who control the shaft sell food down there. You can imagine it's quite a complex logistical operation to get food for thousands of men 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers deep in the earth, down tunnels that sometimes stretch for hundreds of kilometers further. And so when they're down there, they're eating food marked up 500 times or 1,000 times. And so many of them get trapped in this kind of debt spiral where they're down there to dig for gold. They owe the syndicate for allowing them in the first place. And then they're having to buy food to survive. I've also heard that some of them stay for so long just because they're waiting to strike it rich. They're waiting for a big hit of gold so that they can go out and do whatever it was that they were planning to do in the first place. And then finally, some of them don't want to be down there in the first place. They're tricked into the industry. They're recruited with promises of a job, sometimes of a job in the mines, in the legal mines. South Africa does still have some legal mines open, only to arrive at some abandoned shaft and be told, you've got to get in there.
Yeah.
Otherwise you get shot.
Okay, so let's talk about the situation playing out in Stilfontein. I've read that the conditions for the men holding out are deteriorating quickly, with miners surviving on things like toothpaste. They're sleeping next to dead bodies. It's pretty horrible stuff. So just give us some basics. How many miners are trapped, how this story blew up, and what you'll be looking for in the coming days.
So last year, South Africa's president announced this kind of national clampdown on illegal mining of all kinds. They've called it Vala Umgodi, and they've got police and military deployments that are kind of moving around to these illegal mining hotspots, Stilfontein being one of them. So Stilfontein's in this area where there are dozens of shafts. Most of them haven't been mined actively for a decade or more. There's still a lot of gold in the ground, much of it accessible to Zama Zamas working with rudimentary equipment. And as other areas of the country have been clamped down on, there's been this kind of sense that Stilfontein and surrounds are where Zamas can go. So when I was there, I was hearing that thousands of Zama Zamas from other parts of the country have kind of arrived and taken up residence in these abandoned shafts. So Vala Umgodi moved there. They deployed there toward the end of last year, but around about 2 months ago, late September, succeeded in sort of locking down all of the entry points to this underground network. So if we're talking a dozen shafts, that's a vertical tunnel going 1 kilometer or more up to the surface with hundreds of kilometers of tunnel branching off horizontally. They have stationed people at the tops of all of these shafts and essentially stopped any food going down. So when the story started to kind of blow up was when some of these Zama Zamas started to come up to the surface. One of the tunnels there has a functioning elevator, one of the shafts. It's no longer used as a gold mine. It's actually like a pump station for taking water out from other underground mines in the area. And the police started reporting that a few hundred Zama Zamas were coming up at a time. They would travel there, sometimes traveling for days underground through these abandoned tunnels and then handing themselves in. At the same time, a large number got stuck elsewhere in the tunnel network and unable to reach the elevator. This is a shaft that's called Shaft 11. It was once part of the Buffelsfontein gold mine. Shaft 11 was closed down in 2005 officially, and the buildings were knocked down. And the shaft was actually capped over with concrete, but the Zama Zamas a few years ago blew that open so that they could access the tunnels underneath. So right now there's probably hundreds of people underground, possibly more. Nobody really knows.
So you have hundreds of Zama Zamas underground. I think initially the strategy was close off the entries, kind of starve them out. They said smoke them out. But
Yes.
because people didn't want to come up because they would be deported or prosecuted or whatever, they almost waited too long. And now it sounds like many of these men are starving and it's now become a rescue operation. How is the rescue operation going to unfold?
Yeah, so the reports, some of the people who have come up, they've spoken of eating toothpaste mixed into a porridge with toilet paper, which is like ghastly to imagine, the desperation of that. In terms of the rescue operation, I don't really understand myself all of the details because normally these miners wouldn't be climbing out of these shafts by themselves. It's extremely difficult to climb vertically for 1.5 kilometers on a rope. I believe it has been done, but normally there's guys at the surface who are pulling them up. So with this police operation, my understanding is that was just not able to happen and the food was cut off at the same time. When this became sort of an international news story and when the police started talking about people trapped underground and these fairly ill-advised comments, I think, of smoking them out. Very militant rhetoric. That was from a minister in the presidency. There was this kind of sense that a massive humanitarian crisis might be unfolding and that hundreds of people may die. And so since then, there's hundreds of people down there, desperately short on food with their bellies filled with toilet paper. There is a very strong sense that this is not happening quickly enough. And a few of the people who have come up have been severely dehydrated. Some food was allowed to be delivered into the shaft at the beginning of last week. And one of the guys who came up had this gaping head wound and what looked like a dislocated shoulder because there'd been a fight underground over the food because there wasn't enough food. The reporting I've done suggests that the people in control of the shafts underground, they work with the people at the surface. They've still got food down there. They got the guns. They've got a lot of gold. And so I think it's in their interests to have this story become a very high pressure situation where the police allow down a lot of food and bring up a few people and they can stay down there. And a few of the miners who have managed to get out have said this. They've said, our food's getting taken away from us. We're getting threatened with beatings. They're not letting us exit unless we give them all of our gold, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think of these miners being stuck between this kind of tough talking state apparatus and these incredibly organized, kind of ruthless cartel-like groups underground. It's unimaginably horrific, basically.
Okay, so we're going to have more with Kimon after a quick break. Kimon, these mines are so deep. You write that if a Zama Zama falls or is thrown into one of these holes, they can take around 20 seconds to fall. I want to try to just demonstrate how long they're falling. Someone starts falling right now. Poof. A body that will never be recovered.
Yeah, and sometimes they fall for longer. Some of these mines have an updraft because there's so much hot air in the tunnels, and so it's someone falling against resistance. I was looking at some free fall calculations online. It's not inconceivable that someone could fall for 35, 40, sometimes even 50 seconds, depending on the depth of the shaft, the position of their body, and the force of the updraft.
I just cannot think of anything more terrifying. I mean, personally, it's...
No, me neither. In pitch darkness as well.
So there's a truism that the men who got rich during the 1840s gold rush in the Western United States were not the miners themselves, but the men who sold gear to the miners, right? That's how Levi Strauss got started, and we're still wearing his jeans to this day. There's a variation of this for the Zama Zamas, which is that the syndicate bosses didn't get rich selling equipment. It's the food that made them rich. Can you explain how the food industry works?
Yeah, so thousands of people deep underground need to be fed. They can't come up and get food. Someone needs to get it down there, which will mean sometimes packaging tons of non-perishable items in thick plastic wrapping and lowering it down behind a truck or a team of men. Or it'll mean paying mine workers at a functioning shaft to smuggle food in, and then someone from an abandoned mine connects at one of the levels and takes the food from them. This food underground, there's no competition. Whoever controls the shaft controls the food. So I'm going to speak in Rand terms. A bottle of water that can cost 12 Rand at the surface will be like 150 Rand underground. You can get beer down there for 1,500 Rand. These are 500-fold or 1,000-fold markups. Sometimes they get buckets of KFC. So small town KFCs. Actually, the KFC in Stilfontein right now is doing really badly, apparently. It only opened within the past 2 years. And they would have people going and picking up, 40, 80, 100 buckets of KFC to deliver to the miners underground, again for that same markup. So whoever's controlling that flow of food can make millions and millions and millions of dollars. Converting rands to dollars, it's still hugely lucrative. Many powerful kingpins have kind of built up their power through the provision of food, and then use that to leverage their way further up the gold hierarchy in terms of smuggling gold.
So it's a celebratory bucket of KFC underground, 1,000 Rand rand, that's about 55 US dollars. That's an
Oh
expensive
yeah,
bucket.
and KFC can be 5,000 rand. I guess depending on the size of the bucket and how difficult it was to get it down there, but hugely expensive.
Okay, so Kimon, as we wrap up, let's just sort of kind of put this into some perspective, because this story has a bit of everything. It's got illegal immigration, it's got organized crime, it shines a light on South Africa's extreme inequality while also pointing out the failing post-industrial policy of Southern Africa. In fact, you wrote in your New Yorker article that Zama Zamas are a nightmarish late chapter in an industry that more than any other has shaped South Africa's history. And it sounds like you're saying the Zama Zamas are a symptom of a much larger problem. So that means going forward, my question is, does the South African government have any real chance of stopping this illegal underground mining as long as there are thousands of men who are desperate and willing to do it?
So one thing that could stop it would be literally filling all of the shafts. Instead of capping them with concrete that can be blown open, it would be possible to fill them all. I don't know how many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that would cost, and I don't know who would pay for that. The deeper structural forces to me are more compelling and more important to look at, which is that, this is the country with the world's highest income inequality. The Zamas going down to mine gold will be driving past cities with, the most luxurious hotels in Africa to get there. It's a country with extremely high unemployment. It's a country with relatively weak rule of law. Another variable in how this system operates is that there's huge, huge levels of corruption that emanates from the profits earned by this industry that compromises all the agencies that are tasked with shutting it down. So I do see this as symptomatic of much deeper problems. And until there are more compelling alternatives for people to do, instead of, descend into the bowels of the earth to look for gold for some syndicate that doesn't have your best interests at heart, I see it as continuing. And sadly, those problems are much harder to solve than positioning cops and the military at the surface and sealing off the deliveries of food. As soon as they leave Stilfontein, the holes are still going to be there, the gold's still going to be there, the labor force is still going to be there. And I would be astonished if it didn't just revert to what it was before in short order.
Yeah, and what will happen to the men who are lucky enough to actually be rescued and aren't killed underground?
Well, I spoke to one of them. I spoke to one of the guys who'd been rescued. He was South African, So we said that many of the guys doing this work are often undocumented immigrants. He was from the township in Stilfontein. He was very clear. It was his first time underground. He'd been down there for 2.5 months. The food had run out fairly early on. And I asked him, what are you going to do after this? He said, as soon as these guys are gone, I'm going back down there, without hesitating. So I can't imagine he's the only one in town who feels that way.
Well, Kimon, thank you so much for your reporting, and thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
And that's The Take. We really want to hear your thoughts on today's episode. What do you make of the extreme risk that these Zama Zamas are taking each and every day? And what do you think about the way South African authorities are handling this situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you tomorrow.